Good morning, everybody. Happy Hump Day and welcome to the news agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's political correspondent, Dave Burke. Morning, Dave.
Morning.
And there we are in the Mirror's parliamentary office where everything, as you can see, is ramping up for Prime Minister's question.
This is where the magic happens.
That's where the magic happens. Now, this is the People's Paper Review, so get into the comments, ask us your questions. We'll do our best to answer them for you. Those of you listening on podcast will just have to ask yourselves, as many MPs are this week, whether you'd like to take your own life or have someone else do it for you. So, what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on a report showing 1 in 4 children aged just 5 have an average of 3 rotten teeth, as Minister Stephen Kinnock vows to reform dentistry payments and introduce teeth brushing programs in schools for youngsters. Almost all of that tooth decay is due to sugary food and drinks, so bear that in mind, parents, if you're out there. Now, inside, one of the biggest stories of the day, already being discussed quite widely on the airwaves this morning, is Dave's story from page 8, in which a new move aimed at deterring migrant boat crossings has been announced. Dave, can you take us through this? What are they going to do? What have they done?
So essentially, this is a change in Home Office guidance. The Home Office have said that when people apply for citizenship, there's going to be a presumption against approving them if they came by what they describe as dangerous means. So this would include small boat crossings. This would also historically include people that came to the UK on the back of lorries, etc. But as you say, I mean, the idea is that the government will argue that this is going to be a deterrent. It's worth pointing out this is guidance as opposed to something that's being put in legislation. So the Home Office insists that they're still going to be making decisions on a case-by-case basis, but the guidance is that if someone came over on a small boat, they will automatically be approved for, they would automatically be rejected for citizenship.
Right, okay. So this is just guidance then. This isn't a change in the law, but this is a fairly firm instruction to judges at refugee tribunals, at whatever they call them, that they hold, when they investigate these claims, saying, well, if they've come that way, you're not supposed to let them in, really.
Yeah, exactly that, yeah. I mean, it's not something that's going to be put in MPs and in front of MPs, and that they would have to have those arguments with the backbench Labour MPs particularly, in order to get the legislation through.
But are judges going to abide by guidance like that? Because I would thought that in some regard it's almost illegal. I mean, what do you think, everybody? Do you feel that boat immigrants, when they come here, should not be given a path to citizenship? Or do you feel that perhaps that is something that is beneficial to everybody? How do you feel about it? Morning, Mike. So on the one hand, you know, it is illegal to arrive by boat, right? As it was in the back of a lorry, as Dave says. If you come by boat, you don't get to enjoy the benefits of citizenship. You've committed a crime. That is the argument for it. On the other hand, well, where do you go then? You know, and the majority of those who come by boats are later found to be genuine asylum seekers whose claims are approved, right? These are people who do have a right to leave where they were and to come to somewhere else and ask for help, ask for succor. Now, what happens, Dave, for example, if you fled the Iranian regime, let's say, which is definitely a bad place to be living, where there's no British embassy, there is no visa scheme for you to come over here, there is no legal route to get out whatsoever. Let's say you speak English, let's say you have family here, every reason to come to the UK to start a new life and why you'd come here rather than anywhere else. But the only route open to you is going to be coming on a small boat or otherwise smuggling yourself in. But when you get here, the government says, yes, you're definitely a refugee. You definitely have a good reason to leave where you came from. But you're never, and you are protected by international conventions as a result, you're never going to have citizenship here. How can they work? Could they pay taxes? Because asylum seekers, when they're having their claims processed, can't do that. Will they forever be sort of a second-class citizen if this guidance was followed?
Well, I think this is the issue. I mean, like you say, there's a very live debate at the moment because the government's pushing through its borders bill. Like you say, there's many parts of the world where if they don't have a specific scheme that allows people to come over, a specific visa scheme like they have for Hong Kong, like they have for Ukraine, and like they had in a limited state, certainly for Afghanistan, there's large parts of the world where people don't. People argue that take Eritrea, Sudan, etc. as well. You've got large parts of the world where people are coming from conflict zones, from areas where there is widespread persecution of people, who say that they don't have any other means of coming other than by by coming by small boats or by sort of coming into the country by another means that the government deems as being illegal, like on a lorry, etc. So yeah, it's a very complex issue. I mean, it doesn't affect people being given indefinite leave to remain, but certainly the human rights groups, the refugee charities, etc., argue that this is unnecessarily punitive. This does keep people, like you say, will be consigned to remain second-class citizens through the time that they're in the UK, because solely on the basis of their means of entry. And the counter-argument to that is, well, we've seen in the Commons this week, there's arguments from the left of the Labour Party, from the opposition groups, that there should be an expansion of legal means for people to come over, given that the ways of people doing this when they've got legitimate reasons to want to apply for asylum in the UK. A lot of the time, they can only enter the asylum system when they reach the UK, which they have to do by means like small boats.
Mm. It's like a catch-22. There's no way in, but then there's no way out either. Lindsay says, don't some countries have a category for certain immigrants that isn't full citizenship? Yes, they do. And that's kind of, I think, what we're talking about is a kind of second-class citizenship or a different sort of citizenship. We haven't had something like that here before. And it does raise issues about integration. It raises issues about your right to access for healthcare, or for housing, or for education for your children. And what happens, for example, if you are a genuine asylum seeker, but you're denied citizenship, let's say you're allowed to work, let's say you have a family, your child, if they're born here, has a right to citizenship, but you don't. Then we get in this situation they've got in the US at the moment, where you may want to deport parents because there's some kind of political change and they're going to throw out people without paperwork, but the children have to stay because they're citizens, and then they want to strip citizenship rights, and it gets very, very Trumpian and very messy. Now, the Labour backbenchers are not happy about this, as David said. Stella Creasy, who is the MP for Walthamstow, was on Radio 4 this morning, pointing out, firstly, this would apply to Paddington Bear. All right? Paddington would be stufferoonied on this. He came on a boat, literally, and he would never be allowed to remain. He could never live with the Browns, and that would be that. And she also says this isn't where the polls show. This isn't where the country is either. They want the boat crossings to stop, but they also want genuine asylum seekers and refugees to be given a path to citizenship, to integration, to having a new and better life. Is Starmer going to have to back down on this in some regard? It is only regulation. He's not putting it to a vote, so he's not really risking party unity. So, and if it is only guidance, maybe, and the courts might rule against it, the judges might not agree with it, international law might mean it's not going to be applied for. Is it maybe a bit performative? It's something he wants us to talk about that he's doing, which actually never really changes very much.
Well, I think this is the thing. I mean, we've certainly seen in recent days the Tories, certainly Chris Philp, the Shadow Home Secretary, has been talking about paths to citizenship for people that arrive by small boats. It feels like this is a very easy tweak that the government's made to the guidance in order to, in order to argue that they're batting this away. But I think exactly like you say, this seems very performative. It won't affect people's right to be in the UK. So certainly, sort of, campaigners will argue that this is a punitive measure that will, that will prevent people from being able to apply for citizenship. Which some people, when they've moved into a country, it's an optional thing that you can do. And it's a very big tool for integration. So, this is going to be a very controversial move. But the Home Office will say that they're assessing things on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I imagine if any of us were moving to another country and decided to make it permanently our home, we would expect at some point to be a member of the team no matter after us having served a certain period, perhaps. We'll have to see how this works out, won't we? But I do suspect there's going to be quite a lot of upset and so on around the place today. JC says you owe these people. We were all, literally, everybody on Great Britain arrived on a boat at one time, unless you walked across from France. But even then, you came from France. So we're not really in a position to criticise, I think, too much. Now, on to the big story of the day, which is changes that have been made to the assisted dying bill that was introduced by Kim Ledbetter as private members' bit of legislation late last year. Now, this is a new law about the right to end your life if you are terminally ill, if you have 6 months or less to live. Now, it survived the first vote. It's been undergoing sort of amendments and so on before it heads off on its course through Parliament. Dave, before we get into the meat of what's changing so far in these amendments, can you just explain to us and to the viewers who may not know everything about this, the process that this bill has to go through to get through Parliament and where we are in that at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like you say, this has been put forward by a Labour backbencher, Kim Ledbetter. She has put this forward as a private member's bill. So this isn't something that the government backs. This isn't something that Keir Starmer, Wes Streeting have drawn up themselves. This is something that's been put forward from the backbenchers. And as a result of that, the government itself isn't taking a position on it. The process at the moment is that it's been through, as you say, the first vote in the Commons. It passed by a majority of 53, but that's not the final thing by any stretch. Once they've done that, it then goes to what's called committee stage. So they've been hearing from experts over the last couple of weeks, and then the amendments will be put to the bill before it's put for another vote in the Commons, and that's going to be absolutely telling, because the changes that have been made to that, where some people may previously have supported it, the last time it was in the Commons, they will still need to be on board for it to pass through. Then it will need to go to scrutiny to the in the Lords as well, who are likely to also raise concerns. This can set off a process called ping pong, whereby if there's something that the Lords object to strongly and they suggest amendments, it will be taken back to the Commons for the Commons to then vote on the Lords' amendment. So, I mean, there's still a very long stretch ahead of this bill before it can possibly become law.
Yeah, so it's in the process and it's already undergoing some changes. Now, the changes that are being made are things that have drawn quite a lot of debate in the last sort of 24 hours. Jeanette says it should be allowed in certain cases. The issue, I think, Jeanette, is whether there's some kind of mission creep in the law if it does come in. That's what a lot of people are concerned about, that it's allowed in certain very strict circumstances, but over time it just broadens out. Now, what is this amendment then? Why does it matter? The first time round, they said in the legislation, I think, Dave, that all applications for a right to die have to be approved by a High Court judge. And many considered that, a pretty good protection. High Court judges aren't going to just sign things willy-nilly. That has now been changed, and critics say it's been watered down, while the supporters say, well, it's been beefed up. And they've now got something called Judge Plus, which seems to be minus a judge. I don't understand. What's the change, Dave?
So essentially, it would involve psychiatrists and social workers also helping in making these rulings. The argument behind this is that because the legal system is so jammed up at the moment, the idea that a High Court judge will be able to A, find the time to be able to list this, and B, be able to make a sort of decision given all the other areas of law that they would need to go across. The argument is that by involving people that have skin in the game, as it were, sort of psychiatrists, social workers who are better able to, it's argued, better able to spot signs of coercion and sort of address some of the concerns that have been raised in passing of this bill, that this will make it stronger, because it will mean that it's probably going to get a level of scrutiny that it might not have had with a High Court judge involved. However, the High Court judge, I think, for some MPs that backed it the last time round, may be a line in the sand. It'll be interesting to see when this comes back to the Commons, whether people think, well, we were happy with this because we thought there was a set in stone legal process that, it was going to the High Court judge, who's obviously sort of at the height of the sort of legal system, will be able to make viewings on this, and that in itself is a very strong safeguard. So
yeah, So, how do you feel about this, everybody? Do you want a High Court judge involved or not? Would you rather have this panel of experts, psychiatrists, social worker, people who perhaps there's more people thinking about it rather than just one probably old chap? Is there still going to be a judge involved in the process somewhere? I mean, is a judge going to be on that panel with the other two, Dave, or is the judge sort of a final course of recourse if the panel somehow can't agree?
Yes, that's right. So the panel will be chaired by a senior judge. So there will still be a judicial element to it, but it won't go through the court process as the sort of as was initially planned when it first went through the Commons.
Right, okay. So there's a senior judge who's not in a court, but has a panel of other people who know a bit more about some of this stuff than he does, that is helping to inform his decision. But presumably, if there's someone on the panel who doesn't like it, I mean, let's say there's 3 people on the panel, is there a vote? Is it still the judge's choice ultimately? Or, are they just feeding stuff in and he can ignore them if he wanted to?
That's a good question, and I'm not entirely clear on this in terms of how the vote itself would work. I mean, you would assume that sort of in the same way that magistrates reach decisions, it would need to be they would need to agree a collective decision, even if there's a member that has sort of a level of concerns about it.
Yeah, you can imagine there being cases, and we've had lots of cases about right to die and so on that have gone all the way through the courts, where say there's 2 people who think one way and one person who thinks the other way, and it ends up whenever ultimately this is all a horrible mess and nothing really gets done. Peter Holloway says if you really don't have a life and you need people to look after you, then you should have a right to this. I think some of the concerns that have been expressed in Parliament, Peter, are that if let's say that you have 6 months to live, which is what this bill is about, and you are definitely terminally ill, maybe you're in some kind of extreme pain, that can be something that everyone understands. But there may be other people who perhaps having great psychological pressure, who are not terminally ill, but may be at risk of taking their own lives. Do they get covered by this as well? And at what point do you start saying, well, this is a line where you can or can't do it? Where do you draw this line? Because there's big grey areas here. Barbara says no one should be forced to live a life they don't want. A lot of people are concerned that people would be forced to die a death they don't want either, on both sides. So, surely going to a High Court judge would also be, I'd have thought, Dave, quite time consuming, because they've got to list it, they've got to go through a court process and so on, or even in front of this panel. It would be quite expensive as well.
Well, this is the
High Court judge's time. How does someone who is perhaps poorer, perhaps more likely, therefore, to have a terminal illness or a difficult death, how are they're going to struggle with this on most counts? If you've only got 6 months to live and you've got to go through a long-winded process, it's going to be really horrible and difficult anyway, maybe expensive. Does a panel make it more expensive and quicker, or cheaper and longer?
I mean, a lot of the detail still needs to be ironed out. I mean, certainly in terms of how much it would cost, for example. I mean, none of that I've seen has been made available. But I think certainly, like I said, the strong argument for this is that the pressure on the legal system already. Courts have such huge backlogs to deal with. It's kind of difficult to project how many cases we'd be likely to see, particularly at the beginning, and whether it would have a snowball effect, whether this would maybe be more common in 5 years' time than it is when it's when the law first passes, if it were to pass. So I think there's it's certainly an argument. I think people within the court system will argue that another few thousand cases, which potentially it could be over the course of the year, would add extreme pressure to the legal system, which is already experiencing extreme pressure. So certainly one of the compelling arguments towards having the panel instead would be that it alleviates this and also introduces some expertise.
Yeah, it does sound like being a judge is going to be sort of the growth industry of the future. You're going to have a lot of asylum claims to deal with. There's a lot of court backlog, and now there's this whole new stuff as well. They're going to need more judges, aren't they? Diane says, be very careful with this kind of law. In Australia, it is widening the use, and a proposal has now been put forward that it can be requested and agreed to over the phone. It's being abused here. Some similar allegations have been made in Canada, I think, but they've also got an assisted dying law. And one thing I'd just like to raise, I think, that doesn't get talked about very much in this, one of the new appointments to the Trump administration in the US, I can't remember his name now, but he's had some old tweets that have come out, and some of them have suggested, and I quote, sterilizing those with a low IQ. A few little snip here with old Mother Nature's pruning fork, and we don't need to. We'll be a brighter, better species. Now, if anyone's uncertain, that's eugenics, and that is something which informs the assisted dying vote for lots of reasons. A lot of disabled people are very concerned about it. And if you have never heard of it, Google something called Action T4, Action with a K. It is a program which was introduced in 1930s Germany, whereby people were offered the chance to have their disabled family members or themselves sterilized so they didn't pass their disabilities on to another generation. That then became forced sterilization. It then became euthanasia. It then became something where it needed mass killings to happen, which was signed off by doctors. Then they invented a gas called Zyklon B to make it quicker and easier. And of course, that eventually led to the concentration camps and the Holocaust. Now, we are a long, long way from anything like that. But as Diana's just said, you do get mission creep in these things. And we do seem to have, Dave, a sort of a period in politics internationally where things that we thought we'd never hear said again are being said. There's going to be a lot of concern, isn't there, in Parliament when this comes back for a fresh vote, that actually the mission creep, the eugenic aspects of the whole thing, that it could, you could pass a bill now for the terminally ill, and in 5 years' time, let's say we got a populist government that wants to, I don't know, make slightly fewer asylum seekers, would use it for something far worse. That's going to be the concern, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I can see that argument to an extent. I mean, I think certainly the backers of this, and I think all MPs at the moment will say that this is going to be passed with very firm parameters. Anything that any changes to this would require further legislation to go down the path that you suggested. All these measures would have to be put in front of MPs and would have to go to a vote. And you would like to think, I mean, certainly that, sort of taking it, sort of expanding this any further, you feel like this feels like a bill that is pushing people's consciences to the limit in terms of where they feel they could go. I think any, sort of any moves in the future to go further, you'd think it would need a massive demographic change in Parliament, which obviously is entirely conceivable. But it would need a massive change. This isn't something like this bill alone couldn't, couldn't include an expansion of the number of people that are eligible, for example, without it then going in front of Parliament again. But like you say, there is a concern that people think, well, once we've passed this hurdle of passing the first bit of legislation along these lines, then sort of it does then set a precedent that perhaps this can be built on. But certainly the safeguard is that in order to expand this would need further legislation. You need to convince enough MPs in the Commons that what you're proposing is ethical, is the right thing to do.
Yeah, as we've just seen in the first part of the show, once you've got a law, you can just issue some guidance, perhaps to some extent, about something that may seem unreasonable to people, and it's only an option. You don't have to do it, but it can change the tone of things. And as Paul just said, Sweden very recently had legislation about sterilising the so-called feeble-minded as well. One of the reasons I know about Action T4 is it applied to people with epilepsy, which I have, and therefore I'm rather sensitive on the topic. But I'm not someone who at the moment has a terminal illness and is in great pain and wishes to end my life. I think if I did get to that situation, I probably would want to. It's a very sticky, very difficult thing to be talking about, which is why it's a private member's bill, it's not a government bill, and it's why Keir Starmer is not whipping anybody to support or not support it, although it does sort of have the support of time in the House at the moment to be debated. So the big question, I suppose, that we should end on, Dave, is whether we are actually going to get this law, if it's going to come through. Like you said, last time the vote passed with a 53 majority, but a lot of people, a lot of MPs then said they only voted because they wanted to have this debate. They wanted to hear what the possibilities were, and therefore their vote was really super conditional. That majority of, I think it was 53, is not by any means really a clear majority. It's quite shallow. It could change very quickly to being 53 the other way. If the changes are enough, these amendments to alter that support, either for or against, it may well be quite a lot of those floating voter MPs are going to change their minds about how firm they are on this, decide perhaps the debate's gone on long enough and we things aren't safe enough, we don't have the judges to do it, it can't really be done at this stage. Do you think, how are you sort of assessing the temperature in Parliament? Are they becoming more pro this bill, more anti, or are they still somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting one. I mean, I think, like you say, there's a lot of MPs that voted for it, perhaps reluctantly, not necessarily sort of on the basis that they would vote for it again. But, I mean, this is such a big area of law and it's been explored several times in the past and legislation hasn't gone through. I think there's a strong feeling that this is something that certainly needs a lot of scrutiny, needs a lot of examination. And I think a lot of MPs gave their votes before Christmas on that basis, that, look, let's hear from the experts. Let's hear what can be done in terms of sort of tightening up, including the safeguards, and sort of seeing practically how this could work. And then at that point, let's put it in front of MPs. I mean, I think although it passed the what's called the second reading, like you say, with a majority of 53, I don't think we can necessarily assume that these same 53, when they've seen the level of detail, would back it, or even that the 53 at that point were necessarily committed to doing it. I think they wanted to see the detail, wanted to make sure that the debate was held, wanted to make sure this was put up for scrutiny. And then perhaps they could think, well, instead of sort of closing the door now to this debate happening, let's hear from the experts. I've got some very big concerns about this. I'm not necessarily sure that this is what I think is the right thing to do from an ethical point of view, from a policy point of view, from a practical point of view. But let's hear the evidence and let's see where we then go from it. So I think it's going to be a completely different dynamic when it gets put in front of the Commons again. And like you say, it would only take 28 MPs to change their mind about it, which I can very conceivably see happen to stop this bill progressing any further. Yeah. So I mean, I think this really could go down to the wire.
Yeah, I can see as well that quite a few MPs would think, well, let's send it to the Lords for some even more reasoned debate, because we can still kill it when it comes back. And that they would think it should, perhaps have some legs for a bit longer before it goes on. And we could well find ourselves in a situation where your local MP has voted both for and against assisted dying, which is, of course, where most of us would also land, probably, if we were talking about this. It is somewhere where you can sort of see both sides quite clearly. Right, well, we'll have to see how that pans out. Do we know when the next vote is going to be, by the way, on this before we end it?
We don't know. I mean, it certainly needs to be within the parliamentary term. Yeah, I mean, we would probably expect it within the next, I think, probably 2 or 3 months. But then, like I say, there's a long process even beyond that vote happening.
Yeah, and it's go through the Lords and go through the Lords committee stages and all their amendments, and then come back to the Commons, and they do or don't like the Lords amendments, and then it can be killed off, as it were, pardon the pun, with just one vote, despite having had many votes perhaps in support of it. We'll have to see how it goes. We'll come back to this. Thank you, Dave, for taking us through that. Thank you, everyone, for your considered opinions as well. Now, we have managed to find some good news for you, and here it is. Now, it is not often that MPs agree to be treated a bit more like ordinary civilians, but it has finally happened in at least one of the subsidised bars that they drink in after hours. Now, there are allegations of drink spiking in the Strangers Bar that were reported in January, which of course is very shocking for those involved. The place was shut down, it was overhauled, and MPs have now approved the installation of CCTV to keep a watch on them while they get drunk at our expense, as well as drink covers for glasses, extra security and training for the staff, who probably, I suspect, are going to be spending more time throwing MPs out and other people who are, I think, the Strangers Bars for visitors to the estate generally. So, Dave, is this proof that even those who are absolutely determined to avoid scrutiny and misbehave away from the public eye will eventually be forced to accept their freedoms are curtailed whenever it impacts on someone else's safety and well-being? There comes a point, doesn't it, where you can't have that freedom anymore.
I mean, the absolute crucial point at the heart of this is that there's a live police investigation. I mean, it's a very serious allegation. It's in regards to a female parliamentary worker who says that she was in a bar, she was spiked. And I mean, it's an incredibly serious thing to be happening. I mean, we're in the heart of where the laws around spiking are passed. And it speaks very much to, sort of it's absolutely appalling that obviously this, that something like this would happen here. I stress still that it's an allegation and it's still being investigated, but it's clearly being taken very seriously by the Commons authorities. And yeah, it's absolutely right. I mean, knowing that these concerns are there, people on the estate need to feel safe, whether they're an MP, whether they're a staffer, whether they're a visitor. So yeah, these steps have been brought in order to be able to open it in an environment where people do feel safe. Now that we know that this, this allegation has been made that this has potentially happened, it's it's a very important step in order to be able to make people feel safe.
Now, I suppose the qualification is that it's at the moment it's only in the Strangers Bar, and there's probably about a dozen other bars and tea rooms where you do not have CCTV and the same coverage and the same protections. Presumably, if you're the person who's misbehaving, allegedly, you're just going to go to one of the other bars, aren't you?
I mean, potentially. I mean, like you say, the measures have been brought in. I mean, we know absolutely nothing about. There's not been any arrests. There's certainly not publicly been any potential suspects identified. But yes, like you say, I mean, there are several bars, several tea rooms, several cafes, etc., on the estate. And at the moment, these measures are only being brought in Strangers Bar.
Yeah, well, hopefully it would actually sort of precipitate a change of opinion and attitude and atmosphere, I suppose, in the other places. Paul says some of the few pubs that are actually staying open, perhaps more people should subsidise their pubs. Thank you, Paul, for referring to the Mirror's campaign to support Britain's pubs, which are shutting down at a shocking rate, obviously not in Parliament. Steve says they shouldn't have a bar at work. The argument, and we can go into this if you like, but the argument is always that, well, they need to have somewhere to go and to entertain and to also wind down. And if you did it in the pubs outside Parliament, there'd be huge security risks. And they would obviously be targeted by terrorists as well, which would be very difficult. You don't want that kind of security at the Red Lion down Whitehall, because it's going to be pretty much impossible to keep that absolutely safe. So there are arguments there, but at least they're having some kind of scrutiny. Maybe it sort of applies through the rest of the bars as well eventually. I've got to say, whenever I've been drinking in Parliament, I've always felt perfectly safe, Dave, apart from, when there are Tories coming too close. That's always a bit worrying. But we managed to get through it. So thanks, Dave, for taking us through all of this. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. And we'll have to just sort of see where the extra scrutiny goes when they're talking about asylum seekers, about assisted dying, or indeed where they're going to have a drink tonight. Things will develop, I'm sure. Thank you very much, everybody, for taking part. Prime Minister's questions will be on these channels at 12 o'clock noon, so tune in for that. We will see you all again on Monday for another edition of the News Agenda. Until then, everyone, stay safe. Take care. Tatty bye.